Good morning and welcome to Veterans Heartbeat, on the pulse of the veteran, where we discuss issues of health, happiness, opportunity, and well-being of interest to the veteran community, their families, and the community who honors them.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of Veterans Heartbeat, brought to you by River, the Rural Institute for Veterans Education and Research. My name is Jason Zentgraf. My co-host Ed Lisowski is here with me, and he is the Executive Director of River. We welcome you to a weekly wide-ranging discussion of issues, events, opportunities, and needs in our veteran community. Today we are joined by Janet McCord, Associate Professor of Thanatology at Marian University in Wisconsin. How are you doing, Janet?
I'm doing okay, Jason. How about you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for asking. What I'll do is I'll send it over to Ed, because I know he is, his focus is definitely on suicidology, which is obviously your focus. Before I send it over to Ed, do you want to explain what thanatology is?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanatology is the study of death, dying, grief, and loss. And what I do here at Marian University is I run a Master of Science degree program in the study of death, dying, grief, and loss that basically prepares people for a broad range of positions, supporting people who are grieving, working in the area of suicide prevention and suicide postvention, which is grief after suicide, and many other related tasks for hospices, hospitals, funeral homes, and nonprofits. So that's what thanatology is, but my main expertise is in suicidology, and I've studied suicide for probably 30 years.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is just misconceptions or lack of knowledge or education on the area. Suicide is such a taboo subject. I'm sure some of our listeners are like, oh, geez, I don't want to hear about this. But I'd be interested to see what your opinion was as to why it is such a taboo subject and why people are so afraid to address it or even talk about it.
The reason it's a taboo subject goes back more than 2,000 years. Okay, it is part and parcel of the fabric of our culture in the West. This notion that suicide has been aligned with sin and crime for the last 2,000 years. So, back in hundreds and hundreds of years ago, they could not bring the corpse of someone who died by suicide out through the door of the house. They'd have to take it out through the window because of the fears that that person's spirit would haunt that residence.
Wow.
All right. There's dozens of stories about people who died by suicide. They were not, first of all, allowed to be buried in the churchyard because they died of a sinful act.
Right.
They would often have to be buried at a crossroads, so that the spirit did not know which way to go to get home.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, so there was a case back probably in the Middle Ages in the UK of a man who had slit his throat, but he lived. They stitched him up. They put him in prison. They convicted him of the crime of trying to kill himself, and then they hung him. Now, how much sense does that make?
Yeah, geez.
So there's an enormous amount of stigma that persists. Now, stigma persists around mental illness and seeking help, and stigma surrounds suicide as well. So that people that are grieving the death of their son or their daughter or their brother or their sister or their parent from suicide will often have the experience that people that they thought were their neighbors and their friends now run the other way when they see them in the grocery store because they don't know what to say. Do they mean to be mean? No, I don't think that they do. They just don't know what to say because it's such a taboo. It's so not part of their daily life.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for that. What I'll do is I'll send it over to Ed. Ed, you got any questions for her?
Well, good morning, Janet. How are you doing this morning?
Good morning. I'm doing great. Doing great.
Well, recently we were over in England, and we went to a conference called Critical Suicidology. Can you explain what critical suicidology is?
Sure, I probably can. So critical suicidology kind of includes emerging work in anthropology, is developing theoretical and practical tools that go against the current one-size-fits-all trend in suicide prevention and suicide intervention. So what's happening right now in suicidology, even globally, but particularly in the West, in the United States, North America, and Europe, Western Europe, is that suicide is still considered by too many people as a symptom of mental illness, not as its own thing. And there is a tendency to consider suicidology only from a biomedical and quantitative research perspective. It's an evidence-based trend. And so this group that they've decided to call this movement the critical suicidology movement is kind of a counterpoint to current research on suicide. It's we look at suicide from a collaboration between positivist studies and qualitative research, and this collaboration will emphasize the importance of ethnographic, phenomenological research on suicide. And so it kind of rethinks the very meaning of evidence-based care versus a good or bad death or a good or bad life, if that makes sense. And that information comes from the Critical Suicidology website. They've put up a really cool website that kind of explains what critical suicidology is.
Well, in Montana, we've been at the high end of the spectrum for veteran suicide for the past 30 years. Mm-hmm. We've also had the highest rates of per capita suicide in the civilian world.
Yes.
So what you're saying is this movement addresses that in a different way than what we've been doing for the last 30 years. That's
correct. It actually addresses it in a different way than what we've been doing in the past half century. It's really a place for diverse voices to come together around the notion that the whole field of suicidology has become very narrowly focused on individual pathology rather than taking into consideration the cultural contexts and not taking into consideration societal pressures on individuals and cultures.
Let's try to bring this into where somebody can understand what we're talking about, because we're throwing a lot of big words out here.
There are lots of big words there.
All right, and we're going to take Veteran A, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, in Montana, Veteran A might become suicidal.
Okay.
So, current model, what you're saying is they're going to treat it with mental health.
That's correct. What they will want to do, if presented with suicidal Veteran A, is try to assess that individual and figure out what mental illness or psychiatric illness that person has. The biomedical model says that if you can identify the specific presenting psychiatric illness and you treat that, then the person should, as they are treated and they get better, they should become no longer suicidal.
Okay, but now we know from statistics 40 to 50% of all suicides are not mental health, they are physical health. Is that correct?
To a certain degree, I would agree. I don't know that it's necessarily physical health. What I will agree with is that the commonly used statistic that 100% of suicides had a mental illness is just wrong and based on bad research. What we know is between 40 and 50% of people who die by suicide, whether they're veterans or not, were in mental health treatment at the time of their death. That's not 100%. And Edwin Schneidman, who was really the founder of the entire movement of suicidology, and he did his work beginning in the 1950s, disagreed that every person who died by suicide had a mental illness. He saw it as, what he wanted to understand was what was logical about suicide to the person. What is it that made sense to the person who was feeling so awful about life, that made suicide make sense? What was it? So he did a great deal of research. Much of that research is being expanded upon by people in this critical suicidology movement. So what we know now, better than we used to know, is that there's a lot of different drivers, things that drive the suicidality of people. And those can be physical illnesses. It can be physical pain. If someone is in chronic pain all the time, they are very much at risk for suicide. There can be other physical issues as well. Traumatic brain injury, for example.
Yeah, I'd like to hit that one real quick with you, if that's okay.
Sure.
At the Institute, we've been studying traumatic brains, and we've been studying the auditory trauma.
Auditory trauma?
Gunshots, blasts.
Yes.
Etc. And what we're finding, and this is backed up by studies from the VA themselves, is it's causing a vestibular problem, and that's what we've been talking to the folks on Veterans Heartbeat about. Now, that causes inner ear problems, which causes balance problems, which causes the anxiety.
Right.
And because we're so ingrained that if you display any type of behavioral problems, it's mental health. Is that what you're talking about with critical suicidology?
I think that's certainly a very big part of it. Yeah, this is why yes, it fits right in with critical suicidology. To look at other elements other than just the mental health component. Absolutely.
Takes special training to look at other elements. When we went to that conference, can you explain, and I still shake my head, but the first word that they wrote, I think it was Ian wrote on the board, was anybody that studies suicide, he labeled them as misfits.
Yes.
Care to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And as a matter of fact, I was so excited to learn about the Critical Suicidology Conference. And this one that we just attended in Canterbury in the UK was the second conference ever that this group has had. The first one was a year previously, June of 2016 in Prague. If I had known about it, I would have been there. The other thing that we talked about a lot at that conference, Ed, if you remember, is how we were all of us attending this conference were kind of misfits when it came to suicidology, because the mainstream suicide conferences focus very, very heavily on quantitative research, risk factors and warning signs, and clinical intervention.
Bingo. Now, that's something that I want all of our listeners to understand. That right there, and I have a lot of grieving families that have seen, what they quantify as the warning signs post-suicide, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they were missing something.
That's absolutely correct. It doesn't mean at all that they were missing something. The whole notion of risk factors and warning signs has become almost irrelevant. the thing about suicide is that it's so multifaceted. There are so many variables, so many different things that go into any individual's suicide, that we are now having risk factors and warning signs in the hundreds. In the hundreds. First of all, you can't keep those all straight in your head. And second of all, just because, Freud said years ago, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right? So something that's a warning sign for one person may not be a warning sign for somebody else.
Now, one thing that I know our time's getting a little bit short here. I want to hit what you and Jason and I have been working on is we teach at the Institute an educational program, and in August we start our suicidology courses. Mm-hmm. So what we have found at the Institute, and I'd like to have your input, what you're finding at the university, how important is education in all of this?
I think it's hugely important. I have to say that I agree with Paul Quinnett, who created something called QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer. And his whole idea was to create 1 hour or 90-minute community educational experiences to essentially teach people, anybody, the dry cleaner, a taxi driver, the guy who works at the grocery store, an office worker, anybody, a farmer, to teach anybody who comes to be able to say suicide out loud without, choking, and to also begin to understand what suicide is about, to kind of get themselves over the stigma of it, so that if they run into somebody that they see frequently and they notice that something seems a little off, it seems like maybe that person's a little agitated, a little anxious, maybe looking like they're having trouble coping that day, that they would be able to sit down with that person and ask them what's going on, and be able to reach out to another person. For me, what that kind of education does is it allows everyone to understand a little bit more about suicide and reduces the stigma so that people are not afraid to talk about it. So is that what you're getting at?
Well, let me throw some more statistics out at you, okay?
Sure.
First of all, I just read these statistics off of Camp Hope in Houston, Texas.
Okay.
So 1 out of every 3 veterans have some sort of disorder or issues that would be potentially diagnosed as a mental disorder.
1 out of 3?
That's what they're claiming.
That seems a little high to me.
It may be. I'm just giving you these statistics.
Got it. Mm-hmm. All right.
The ones that really kind of stood out to me, and in the Institute, we've done thousands of interventions. And that one was, out of 10 veterans that have issues of any kind, only 4 of those veterans will seek any kind of help.
Okay.
That means 6 veterans out of 10 will not seek any kind of professional help.
Okay.
That opens the door to, if we're going to solve this problem, we've got to open the door to non-professionals, peer support.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
What's your thoughts on that? Because that's a very controversial statement in the mental health realm.
Well, I'm not coming out of the mainstream mental health realm.
And that's why I'm asking it.
Yeah, okay. And I'm not a mental health clinician.
No, but you have a PhD.
I'm not a therapist, but I'm a PhD, but in literature and religion. So I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not a clinician. So I always like to make that clear because I'm not speaking out of that context at all.
But there were like 27 psychologists at that conference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were a lot.
And they had pretty much this opinion. Go ahead.
They had pretty much which opinion? That
it didn't have to be a professional mental health expert.
That's right. I don't think it does either necessarily. Okay, necessarily. I think that there certainly are some, some psychiatric disorders where people can benefit from professional care, but only if they can be receptive.
In other words, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
That's correct. And sometimes, very often, as a matter of fact, well, what we know statistically, here, let me throw another statistic your way. We know that only half, or maybe fewer than half, of clinicians know what to do with a suicidal person if they walk in the door. They don't even know how to approach it, and they themselves are so afraid of it that they often don't even want to be the clinical carer for that individual. This is where we get into issues where clinicians are quick to hospitalize. These days, hospitalization is only usually a 72-hour hold, and nobody gets any treatment in 72 hours. So there's no treatment happening. Okay? Now, I think that it takes a village to prevent suicide. We need to have a broader base of common knowledge about what suicide is and what it's not. We need to know that listening to someone can make an enormous difference in their lives, and listening without judging. So anyone that walks into a clinician's office will be able to know within the first 5 minutes whether or not that clinician is being judgmental. And if the clinician is being judgmental, not too much care is going to take place. So can peer support be enormously helpful? Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is the kind of support that's offered 24/7 in crisis lines and on text lines.
We do have a text line here in Montana now.
Fantastic.
But here's a question for you. Mm-hmm. Veterans talk. I'm sorry, but something happens to one, and before you know it, I would say all 110,000 of us know it here in Montana.
Okay.
So where some of the mistakes are is when you're in that state, if you reach out and they send the police to do a wellness check, all of a sudden that line is compromised.
Okay.
Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, it would seem to be a counterproductive measure. And if instead of sending police out to do a wellness check, there was a way to send other veterans out to do a wellness check, you'd probably get a lot further.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. We are winding down on time, so one last question, I guess statement. Do you have anything you want all the listeners to hear, one message you want them to take away from this show?
I guess for those who might be suicidal or living with going in and out of being suicidal, I would urge them to seek good help. Find someone to listen. There are even books that they can read to self-educate, to try to get a handle on what's going on, because it can be frightening. And for those who are grieving the loss of someone to suicide, I am so sorry that you have to go through it. But there are other people that can support you and can help you through and down that journey and walking that road.
And I invite any of the listeners that wish to have more education. We will be providing free classes on this subject at the Institute.
And that's tremendous. I think that's wonderful. To be able to get that kind of an education around suicide, that's wonderful.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. McCord, for coming on our show. We really appreciate it. And, there's a lot of good information there. Very interesting show. So thank you for your time, and hope you have a good rest of the day.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for listening to Veterans Heartbeat. We'd not be able to bring it to you without all the support of the listeners. Thank you to our main sponsor, River, the Rural Institute for Veterans Education and Research, who has an array of services such as veterans-focused education, a free vestibular disorder clinic, and many more services. Check them out on Facebook or on the web at riverofchange.org. Lastly, we'd like to show our appreciation to all of our veterans. Thank you for serving our country and keeping us safe.